Okay, last hot take here. This is for the feminists, and I'm going to wrap up the show. Directed towards the feminists. Related to our patriarchy and feminism and oppression talk. Hot take. Men have been more oppressed than women. Agree or disagree?
In some sense, agree. In some sense, disagree.
In totality.
Are we talking about in history as well? All throughout history? Or
historically and currently. And currently.
Ooh.
No.
Disagree?
Historically, definitely not.
Definitely not? Okay. Anybody? V? Agree?
Totally
disagree?
agree.
I'm still analyzing what the
Okay,
question
what about
is.
you? Thoughts? You're a feminist?
I disagree.
Into the mic if you can.
I disagree.
Disagree?
Men have been more oppressed than women?
Men have been more oppressed than women, both historically and in current time, modern time.
I think I disagree.
Disagree? Katie?
I disagree historically, but I definitely see it becoming an issue currently.
Currently, okay.
Yeah.
Grid 1 Motorsports donated $100. Women care of infants and the household, men raised children and mold children into grown men and women. All studies point to children raised by men do better than children raised by mothers alone.
Yo, she said, did you hear what she said? She said this guy has too much money.
If you ever feel like you want to share money, I'll drop my Venmo in the bio.
Oh, snap. Okay.
Just send it my way.
So thank you, Grid 1 Motorsports. Appreciate it. What was your answer to my thing?
I agree with Katie.
Kayla, your thoughts?
I feel like historically they had harsher duties and less freedom. They just kind of were given like hard things to do. Mm-hmm. One of them being protecting women, which is harder to do back then because we were taken advantage of. I don't know about now. I really haven't heard a man like complain about much. But I also deal with tough men.
So, I mean, I could approach the argument from quite a few ways. I won't linger too long on this. A few minutes, then I promise we'll wrap up. So, again, there's a lot of different ways that I can make this argument, but I'll just use what I consider to be my ultimate one. So, and this is for both modern day and throughout human history. So, if we look at gender-specific grievances and oppression, if I were to look at the worst woman-specific gender grievance and compare it to the worst male-specific gender grievance, just comparatively, and I'll name it in a sec, I think the male one is orders of magnitude worse than the female one. Now, if I were to even collectively take all of women's collective grievances and compare it to this one grievance that men have experienced throughout all of human history, I would argue that that sole grievance that men have nearly exclusively experienced outweighs in orders of magnitude more than all of women's collective grievances, and that is warfare. Now, you have forced military conscription, which adds even another layer. So not only was there just soldiers who volunteered to be soldiers, but you also had men who did not want to go to war, who were forced into war, and who came back either maimed, injured, severe mental injury, or just outright dead. So that sole male-specific grievance, I believe, outweighs all of women's collective grievances. Let's look at World War I. Let's look at World War II. World War I, casualties were tens of millions. World War II, casualties of war, tens of millions. These casualties, injuries and deaths, were almost exclusively inflicted upon men, the vast majority of which were not volunteer soldiers. They were conscripted into the army. The suffering that men, not just the death, not just the injury, but the actual suffering that men have experienced in the midst of warfare. Take example, trench warfare, trench foot, chemical weapons. These men lose their hearing, tinnitus from the constant barrage of shells. It occurs to me that is a far greater level of suffering than has been experienced by women.
Including losing your child and the word that I'm not allowed to say on here.
I'd like to counter with sex trafficking, the warfare of sex trafficking.
So, okay, well, let me ask you a question. Okay, we'll have to use, we'll do SA.
When that's our
Would you
biggest
rather
thing to
be
here for.
would you rather be murdered or SA'd?
Murdered.
Murdered.
Okay, I mean, okay, that's fine.
Would you rather be murdered or lose your child?
I enjoy what?
Would you rather you yourself die or your child?
I would rather be. I would
it's
rather
two people's
be.
child, though. It's a man's child as well.
I
But
mean,
in your point of saying that the mother's sole purpose is to be a mother and nurture,
Yeah.
and so we are that much more connected with that child. So we are going to grieve the loss of the child that we are that much more connected to than a man.
I think
correct?
it's probably fair to say that a mother would maybe grieve just as much, but also it's a man's child. He's losing a
wait.
child.
So
Absolutely.
just to be clear, so your argument is that, let's just say, throughout all of human history, the sex trafficking that has occurred to women is worse than the tens of millions or hundreds of millions of primarily male deaths that have occurred throughout all of human history.
Yes, because of
Interesting.
patriarchy.
Because of
The war is part of that.
But
The war is part of
just
patriarchy. Sexual assault is not part of patriarchy.
how many men do you think
So if
decide?
you're mad at that, be mad at
How many men do you think
Big man.
decide if we go to war or not? Like,
How many women get decided if they're going to be essayed or not?
I'm not sure I'm
None
following
of
the
them.
logic.
None of the women that
I'm-
get sexually assaulted
I'm
choose
not
to.
following the logic on that at all.
Does
but
anyone else follow that logic?
no, but your argument was, when I said, here's all the men that suffer because of warfare, you said, well, who is inflicting that upon men? And so your argument is, but other men, which to some degree is victim blaming. What
I
does
don't think that. I think you totally just twisted my words. I don't think that's like at all what I
but
just
okay,
said.
if say 100 men send 20 million men to war, so that those 100 men happen to have a penis, that doesn't diminish the fact that all those men that went to war were to some degree engaged, or that they were in the midst of suffering. Perhaps they were forced to war.
I think what she's trying to say is that the patriarchy is run by men, and that patriarchy is what sent these men to war. And I think her argument is that like these women that are sold into sex trafficking, these women around the world that are forced into marriage at 13, 14 years old, like
Which
all of that
I think is
combined
horrible.
is
Don't get me
also
wrong.
by
I think
a male
SA and any sort of trafficking is a terrible thing. But if we're having an intellectual conversation about like quantifiably what is a bigger suffering, I mean, you're going to tell me that tens of millions of men, maybe it's hundreds of millions of men who have died in warfare, is comparable to, I don't know what the numbers are, but it's less than how many men have been to war and who have been casualties of war.
I don't think.
Wait, and I do want to address, somebody made the point of, well, it's men sending other men to war. Actually, if you look at queens, you look at monarchies, they did studies, and they actually found that queens were just as likely or more likely to go to war than kings. So this whole trope of, well, it's men sending men to war, actually queens were just as prepared to send men to war. So the whole argument of, well, it's men doing it to other men kind of falls flat in that regard. I'm sure if there's I am pretty sure if women occupied all positions of government in every single country, I'm pretty sure they're still going to be sending men to war. You don't think so?
Actually, in other countries, they send both men and women.
Like where?
Like in Israel.
Okay,
it's-
that's one singular country.
There's other countries that.
What percentage of countries have only male conscription?
I don't know that number.
I think you'd also look at the casualties in Israel as well, and you'd see that the vast majority of them were men who are going onto the front lines, and women are doing other roles.
That goes on to my other point, that I don't know if the comparison of oppression could be quantifiable by the amount of deaths, just because if we look at historically, the oppression for women starts a lot earlier on. Historically, like, women weren't taught to read. girls weren't allowed to go to school.
Most people weren't. The vast majority of the world was illiterate.
Right.
Yeah.
And then who
like there was
started going?
upwards of 90% of people
And
worked in
then who
agriculture.
started going to school?
Like
I mean-
most peasants, regardless of your gender, were like extremely poor,
But
did not get an
even-
education.
Even the
regar-
wealthy, the only kids that they sent to school were the sons.
Could there be a biological basis for that?
But you're talking about
Okay, if there's a societal expectation that like women are gonna get pregnant and they have to have kids and that would take them out of the workforce, and your family only has the funds to send one of the son or the daughter. This is before birth control, this is before sanitation, this is before women had access to like even tampon, like
so I think
the world looked like totally different. And if you had limited resources, and granted, I'm in favor of the current social order where women are allowed to go into the workforce. I'm in favor of it. However, in the previous social order, if you only had the resources to send one of your children into the workforce, let me just add one thing. Also, medicine was dog shit. If you're a woman and you gave birth, the maternal, your chance of dying during giving birth was much higher back then than it was now. And if the expectation on women was to go and have children and have kids, wouldn't it make sense to invest those resources into someone who didn't have, which we fixed now, we have modern medicine in hospitals. Wouldn't it make sense to invest those resources and that education into a man who doesn't have the risk of death because of pregnancy?
economical factors might still be a thing, but at the end of the day, that's oppression. Not allowing women to go to school is the definition of oppression, whether there are these economic factors, whether there's an expectation that there's such a high level probability that a woman would die at childbirth. These things might contribute to the way society was run. There are reasons for this oppression. It didn't come out of nowhere. Economic factors were a cause, everything that you stated. That's not incorrect, but that does contribute to this history of oppression.
So because now you mentioned education and women who didn't have access to education, that was oppression. Are men currently oppressed because less men go to university? If the differential is 60% of degrees are being awarded to women versus 40% of men, is that evidence of sexism and men being oppressed?
I think that would require a lot more research. Maybe research has been done on the deciding factors of why those students were admitted and why those percentages, because equality doesn't necessarily mean that we would see 50-50 numbers. I'm not sure if a university is looking at two identical applications and they choose to choose a female over a male.
It's affirmative action. Yeah.
So. And
this happens all throughout the workforce as well. People want to hire women over men. They always get preferential treatment. They're undoubtedly looked at more favorably in applications. Would you disagree?
If those are the facts, I haven't seen research studies on that, then.
Well, okay, so let me bring it back to warfare here really quick. So currently in the United States and almost all countries in the world, only men are subject to military conscription. You might say, well, it's been a while since we have had a draft. Well, if you look at the Vietnam War, there are men that would be alive today. They could have been in this room right now. Granted, they would be in, I don't know what, in their 70s, 80s or something, rather old, but they would still be alive today had it not been for this very gendered issue of military conscription, which is something that's only inflicted upon men. And there are men who are alive today who are paraplegics, who have deformities, who have
bad
PTSD, like mental scars that you couldn't imagine, saw horrific things, various injuries that are alive today, that are suffering. A lot of homeless people, who 80% happen to be men. A lot of homeless people are veterans. So, this is something that, and to this day, when it comes to warfare, All men in this country have to register for the selective service, something women don't have to do. And so to me, when it comes to feminism, it occurs to me that feminism will only secure, if equality, feminism will only secure equality if said equality stands to benefit women. So feminism to me is not an equality movement, because if said equality could somehow conceivably come to the detriment of women, feminists will not fight tooth and nail for it. For example, draft equalization. Well, women should be able to get drafted. That would be equality, wouldn't it? But feminists are not fighting for that equality. You only fight for the equality that benefits you. And that's why feminism is not a true egalitarian or equality movement.
Well, I think based on the argument I'm making about sex trafficking, my feminist views are based on bodily autonomy.
Okay.
I think I have to argue for my bodily autonomy first before I can start advocating for other things that I need outside of what's going on right here. If I can't even control what's going on right here within my own body, how do you expect me to fight for something beyond that?
Right, and the bodily autonomy argument is perfectly applied to the forced military conscription argument, and I would actually add another layer to it. First off, abortion is not outright banned, and I'm assuming you're talking about abortion, correct?
Well, I was going to talk about consent and sex or anything like that.
Well, that's not something that's.
Abortion.
I mean, I'm thinking of something that's legislated by the government.
Yeah, we can talk about abortion.
But depending on your state, you can, as a woman, you can still get an abortion in this country. There are certain states where Roe v. Wade pushed it back down to the states. But I mean, I think men have a far greater bodily autonomy argument to be made when it comes, again, to forced military conscription. Every single male in this country, by law, is required to register for the selective service, and every male in this country, depending on their age, is potentially subject to being forced to go and fight and to go and die. And no offense to you, but I would argue that's a bigger bodily autonomy concern than abortion.
Are you with or against military, or do you have an opinion on that state?
Well, here's the thing. I don't think you can get rid of the draft. So I think we should equalize the draft. I think women should be subject to military conscription, because there's
what about,
you can't.
Lessening the war, though.
What's that?
What about lessening the need for war? Instead of being just let's have equal. Where do you stand on?
I mean,
saying
well,
that
yes,
we need
war
to
is
have
bad. War is
military?
bad, but if you can never get rid of the draft, because there's conceivably some scenario where you would need a draft. So it's never going to go away. I don't care. We should just remove this concept that we can never abolish the draft. What feminists need to start doing is fighting for women to be subject to military conscription. To add on to that, you might think, well, there's not going to be a draft, blah, blah, blah. If men don't register for selective service, it's a felony. They face a $250,000 fine. If you don't register, you could face certain penalties, like you won't be eligible for certain federal benefits. You can't get certain federal jobs. You can't get student loans. There's a few others that aren't coming to me immediately. But again, if we're going to have a bodily autonomy discussion, we absolutely need to consider the lack of men's bodily autonomy, and every single one. We're in California. Women have bodily autonomy in California. I don't know how many 18-year-old men there are. Well, you guys go to UCSB. There's about 20,000 students at UCSB. 10,000 of those are probably around your age cohorts from 18 to 21. They've all had to register for the selective service. If they want to vote, that's another thing I forgot. So that's certainly a lot of men locally who don't really have bodily autonomy. But I don't see feminists really fighting for any equalization of that.
I feel like feminists are fighting for equal rights and focusing on getting females to where men are. And so one day, maybe in the future, but we have to get there. That's far in the future. I see where you're coming from. Your point is 100% valid. But I think there's just issues that we're working on right now, and maybe one day in the future, once we've achieved these issues, then this bigger issue can be talked about.
You think in the future women or feminists are going to start advocating, they'll be in the streets with pussy hats saying, we want to get drafted too. We want to get shell shocked.
Well, you guys
we
are,
want to get trench
You guys are
foot.
bringing up two contradictory opinions when you say you want women to stay at home and nurture and raise the kids.
I didn't say that.
Well, prior to this debate, yeah, not right now. I'm talking about earlier in this conversation. You guys had such strong ideals about how a woman like needs to be the nurturer for the child.
I didn't say that. I just said I don't.
That's what I said.
I
Yes.
just said I don't think a woman's career makes her more physically, like makes her more attractive as a potential
Yeah, but
mate.
Jake said that, and then-
I didn't say that they have to.
No, but
I
it's-
said that's my preference.
You
Exactly.
would want
But
to protect
if-
them
if-
to be
if-
stay at home.
If
to
that
protect
is
the kids,
that
though,
is my
right?
preference, and if they do take that role upon themselves, then I would be willing to go to war. For
And think about
example.
historically,
And, we need to
we're
both
talking
ignore
about
that.
World War I, that's 1918. Back in that day, people were having kids at 18, 19, 20, okay? These women, who many men had the same exact values like you did, so it made sense for the men
They still
to be
do.
drafted.
There's a lot of base guys out there.
Exactly, there's a lot of guys like you. They think about this. It makes sense for the guys to go out in war if a man has this,
Yes.
if a man
Yes,
has
yes,
this
yes.
opinion that the woman should stay at home, nurture the kid, raise the kid, you know? So that way he has something to come home to when he's back.
But then again, like I'm saying that I'd be happy to do that and to
Yeah.
take that, to have that gender inequality if that was the case and if my wife was staying at home.
Okay.
But you guys are saying that you don't want to play your role in the gender equality spectrum if we're talking about traditional gender roles, but you want us to play our role.
Well, we're talking about warfare. If it's warfare, it's a different story, because I think my opinion on the matter would change based on circumstance. Personally, for me.
What do you mean? What do you mean? What circumstance?
For example, if there was a war going on and was being drafted, and let's say I had a husband, right, and I had a child, someone would need to stay at home, whether it's me or my husband. We have to make the decision who's staying at home and going to take care of the child.
That's why they say in times of warfare, people go back to their traditional
exactly.
roles.
In terms of warfare,
Yes.
I would revert back to my traditional. I 100% would.
So you're a feminist. You're a feminist in peacetime.
Yes.
You're a feminist.
This
in
conversation
peacetime.
has come full circle.
Yeah.